We're going to focus the scope of this video talking about Bionicle 2003 and how the toys help to reflect the story that was being told in other media. Before we get to that, I did want to share a hidden connection that I just found before making this video, and it actually involves either the Toa Mata or Toa Nuva. If you're familiar with the Toa Nuva sets, then you know that they included some extra gears and friction pins on them to allow you to lock the limbs in place, to lock up that gear function. And that's really cool for posing purposes, but I found out a way to do something very similar as well, which doesn't require you to sort of juggle parts around, right? To swap parts to the back of the model or what have you. And it involves using a Borak tooth. So I'm going to go ahead and take the head off here. I should mention that it's on a swivel thanks to a modified, or rather a custom piece in this case here. And it's a piece you can find on like AliExpress as well. But with that being said, that Borak tooth can actually fit inside of where normally a piece like this would go on the original Toa Mata Tahu set. And what it enables you to do is lock the gear in place because the Borak tooth will fit between the teeth of the gear. However, if you were to turn the gear in the opposite direction, it's going to allow you to disengage that system, kind of like a ratcheting system, and then you can catch the gear again by going down like this, although it's not super consistent. So what I recommend is actually giving a little push to the limb here as well. And it's going to end up locking back in, meshing back in with that 12-tooth gear, and thus locking your limbs wherever you need them to be, as you can see here. And you can lock them basically in any of like the 12, teeth that are on the model, right? So that works out pretty well. Not terribly important for this video. Let's go ahead and get back to what we were going to talk about, which has to do with not only the Rahkshi sets from 2003, but also the Matoran from 2003. In a previous video, I talked a little bit about how Bionicle masks tell a story. And that's not talking about the Bionicle mask design, but rather how they interact with the different pieces they're designed to connect with. Because as you may know, in 2001, with the introduction of the Bionicle Toa and Turaga sets, we got masks that went alongside them. And the McDonald's sets even had these masks as well. However, the difference with the McDonald's sets is that they came with a brand new headpiece as well. And what's special about this head right here is that it is actually made of a different material than the head of a character like a Toa Mata or Turaga. You might think that's not a big deal, but it actually is, because in this case here, the head is made from a material called polypropylene. This might be something that Lego had done because it's just a cheaper plastic, or because it has these fairly narrow little bits they didn't want to snap off, because ABS is much more prone to snapping than bending, where polypropylene is designed more to bend, to be forgiving. And remember, these were made for kids at the end of the day. But one neat side effect of using this head meant that when it was used with your standard Toa Mata or Turaga masks, or the masks that came with the Matoran themselves, these masks were easier to remove from these heads, in a way sort of suggesting that the Matoran are weaker characters than the Toa Mata or Turaga. Now, we know that in the story, the Matoran are quite capable themselves, but they don't have access to certain things that the Toa Mata do. No access to mask powers, no access to elemental powers, anything like that. For all intents and purposes, they are inhabitants that have to rely on their wit and their cunning alone, their ability to adapt to certain situations in order to make their way out. Nuparu couldn't go out of his way to defeat a Borak by just punching it, so he had to invent a machine to do something like that, right? Well, I've talked about how in 2001, the introduction of masks like these, in 2002, the introduction of the Borak basically blowing this system away because the Borak are nearly impossible for the Toa Mata to defeat. Yet they have such an easy time defeating the Toa Mata. And in a way, that's a good way for Lego to incentivize you to buy the brand new sets, because up until that point, the only sets that we had were the 2001 sets and the 2002 sets, right? And if you're going to be playing against other kids on the playground, you're basically approaching Bionicle from one of three directions, right? You're going to be approaching it from tradability and a branch off of that, collectability, right? But you're also going to be approaching Bionicle through battle. This was a big thing seen all the time in plenty of other media. Think Pokemon and other trading card games, where not only did you battle, but you traded and you collected, right? Lego was very much trying to cash in on that, and they definitely succeeded. But when it came to the Borak, there was more to collect, but man, when it came to battle, they wiped the floor with everything else. So for you to stand a chance against your friend who just got the brand new flashy Bionicle Borak sets, you yourself would have to go out of your way to get a Borak. It's really genius, honestly. But the problem is, where do you go from there? Well, there's a fourth aspect to Bionicle that I have not yet mentioned, and it is story. In 2001 and in 2002, the story of Bionicle was relatively simplistic, but it's because it was building towards something. And 2003 was LEGO's answer to this. It was building towards a broader, grander story with a brand new Toa that the Borak could only dream of being able to defeat, because his mask, his legendary Evoki mask, was nearly impossible to remove from the head itself. And yes, while he didn't have an easy time defeating Borak, his weapon was definitely better than most of the Toa Mata's weapons at doing it, being longer, being sort of hook-shaped, and coming in from the bottom, which is a weakness that the Borak have. It's obviously not designed necessarily to interact with those sets, but it can do so. And even if it takes a long time to defeat a Borak with Takanuva, it's going to take a much longer time for the Borak to defeat Takanuva himself. Well, 2003 also introduced us to what was up until this point the most complicated Bionicle sets we had likely ever seen in canister form. Those being the Rahkshi sets. These revolutionized Bionicle, and they were in a way a sort of harbinger of things to come, because a lot of what these introduced to Bionicle would stick around throughout its run until the very end. The extreme amounts of articulation and posability. And these also introduced a brand new function. But here's the thing. After the Borak, this function might feel a little bit underwhelming. And I think that that is a good thing in a way. Because how do you continue to outdo what you've done before? At some point, you're going to reach that ceiling. And it only took Bionicle 1 year in the world of battle, let's say, to reach that ceiling. Borak are just so difficult to defeat. They have their weak points, sure, but the weak point on the Rahkshi is far easier to explain and understand. Just hitting the head from the top down is going to pop open the Krata container and thus launch out the Krata, ultimately defeating the set. And as you may know, when it comes to the Toa Mata, when it comes to the Toa Nuva, the way they use their weapons is by using those downward swings. With the Toa Nuva, it is downward and upward swings in the same motion because both arms work alternate each other. And that's true for some of the Toa Mata as well. But it means that you're going to have a very good chance of hitting this guy from the top down. The thing that's interesting about these guys, though, is while they have this really interesting function, new function, and a new way to approach functions from a Bionicle standpoint, it doesn't actually do a very good job of removing masks. It can do it, but I've talked in previous videos about how masks and how the mask game, the approach to gamifying this system, was primarily designed with hitting the mask from the top in order to knock it off. The weakest point, if you will, of a mask is sort of the apex at the top. You can definitely hit a mask from the side and still knock it off because you get a secondary sort of rotational force. Remember, these masks don't connect to the head in the very center. They connect towards the bottom, meaning that if you're going to hit it like this, you're going to be transferring some of that rotational force back and forth into the mask. And that's going to help to kind of loosen it a little bit, almost like a screw sort of coming out of this. Enough hits and you will knock the mask off. That's not to mention, of course, that you could hook the mask from the side and continue swinging the weapons like in the form of the Rahkshi to actually pull the mask off. So these are very capable of defeating a Toa Mata or a Toa Nuva set. And they're extremely capable of defeating the 2003 Matoran. 2003's Matoran are really interesting because they are an upgrade in almost every way to the McDonald's Matoran, save for one thing. They still use the McDonald's Matoran head. Now, these sets are fully capable of utilizing these headpieces. This may be something that was done by LEGO in part to, once again, bring the budget down. Remember, polypropylene is a cheaper plastic to work with, and it works here just fine. The previous Matoran didn't have eyes in them, so not having eyes here isn't too out of the ordinary, and maybe that polycarbonate, that third material that would be used in these sets for those eyes, would just be too expensive for something like this. Or, once again, maybe it just has something to do with the story. Here's the thing. The 2003 Matoran also utilized the same function as the Rahkshi. It's a little bit different, though. The head also moves with the weapon. And you might think, well, that's not terribly important, but it actually kind of is. Here's the thing. When it comes to Bionicle sets of the past, especially sets that had arms that could stay stationary, you could sort of utilize these limbs as a form of defense. It was minimal, but it was there. It was something you could account for because you could block a mask from being hit from certain sides and then try to counterattack or to defend, to dodge, what have you, by taking your attacks, using them very sparingly and very strategically in battle, but then turning the model to the side when it's sort of an off move, right? And this is something that I did plenty as a kid. Me and my neighbor, we both had Bionicles growing up. He was into it probably up until about 2003 before he started fading out and doing other things. Obviously, I stuck around with it. It definitely sunk its talons into me and didn't let go. But when it came to these sets, while we would definitely make up our own ways to battle, I remember plenty of times where we battled with like the Exotoa, which doesn't have a mask at all. When it came to sets like this, Lego utilizing this mask with this head is, I think, fairly intentional. It is a direct callback to the previous Matoran and how different they are than Toa sets, but why not use the Toa Mata head here? If anything, it would only add to the set. But this mask and this head combination also add something to the set. Once again, bringing back that sort of ease of defeat. Polypropylene is a much more flexible plastic, but it's also a plastic that interacts with other plastics very differently because in a lot of ways, it's a very low friction plastic, unlike something like ABS or especially polycarbonate, which against itself can really bind up and lock up. Something like this almost wants to expel what is connected to it. Obviously not enough to completely detach the mask, but it is incredibly easy to pull one of these masks off of this head versus the Toa Mata head when you're trying it in battle. It still holds it very securely, like you're going to have a hard time just straight up pulling it off. It's not going to fall off on its own, which makes sense. Otherwise, I think Lego would have abandoned this idea. But because the head and the arms move together, your attack also sort of circumvents whatever defense you might have planned, because your arm can't now stay stationary to block your head because your head is moving as well. Everything is moving relative to itself in the upper torso. It's also worth noting, though, because this is a sideways attack, it has a very hard time defeating something like the Rahkshi, because the Rahkshi do not have a weakness to side attacks. And that might sound interesting, right? We talked about how hitting a Toa Mata's mask from the top is its sort of weakest point, which is similar to this. In fact, it's identical to this. And yet, you can knock a Mata mask by hitting it at the side. You can't do that with the Rahkshi head because it is designed differently. Ultimately, the way this works is that on the inside of the model here, which I should mention, this is also polypropylene, probably for a different reason, but we can talk about that in a moment. This piece right here contains the clasp, is what I'm going to call it, on the inside right here, that is able to lock inside of this little channel on the back of the Krata holder. And it is a secure enough attachment to play with. I have definitely heard people say that these are almost too easy to knock Krata out of, which is definitely true. When it comes to one of these sets, if they fall over and their head impacts the ground, as it will so often do when falling off a shelf, yes, it is most likely that that Krata is going to come out of there. But from a play standpoint, this is still a pretty genius move overall, because it means that while a similar attack, a way that the Toa Mata are designed and the Toa Nuva are designed to attack, will work against these sets, other Rahkshi sets, and especially other Matoran sets, actually have a really hard time defeating each other. And that seems to be intentional as well. 2002 sort of conditioned us to buy the next newest and greatest sets, the upcoming sets, because remember, when it came to the Borak, you didn't just want the Borak for collectability, for which there was even more collectability. 8 Krata, now in 12, and then eventually 18 different colors. That's a lot of things to collect that someone's going to want to do, and many people have. But when it comes to the Borak as well, the old sets just aren't good enough anymore. And so you needed the Borak to compete. In this way, though, with these Rahkshi, Lego almost sort of fooled you. They've conditioned you to go and buy the other Borak to fight the Borak. So you want to buy the other Rahkshi to fight the Rahkshi, right? But no, you don't. That's the thing. That's kind of a beautiful thing about this, is that the Toa Nuva are still strong enough, as they are in the movies, to overcome the Rahkshi. And it's not to say that Rahkshi cannot fight each other. They absolutely can. One of the strengths of these sets is the inclusion of this weapon as a staff, as a singular piece, which is going to help to double up the overall friction required to actually move it, because you've got multiple ball joints that have to work in tandem with each other, but it also means the momentum is transferred across this entire object, right? And so, when you are swinging this item around, while it doesn't have a great range on it, maybe only moving about 90 degrees, if even that, what it does have is that it has the ability to sort of tilt at an angle. You don't have to have it parallel or perpendicular to the body, but you can have it at a sort of compound angle. And this means that if you were to sort of stab at something, you have the ability to still strike it at a downward angle. It's never going to be as good as the Toa Nuva at this, because that is their primary approach to these types of attacks. But it is still capable of performing these types of attacks. So once again, what this tells us, and what this reflects in the story, is that the Matoran are never strong enough to defeat the Rahkshi. Can you do it? Of course you can do it. You're just going to have a harder time. And the Rahkshi, even amongst themselves, have a very hard time defeating each other. Definitely possible. More doable than a Matoran. It also helps that the Rahkshi are the same size as other Rahkshi, whereas these Matoran are significantly shorter. If you were going to play with these with any sort of realism, and these are on the ground and these are on the ground, you're never even going to stand a chance. This is just never going to reach that head to be able to hit it in the first place. But of course, a Rahkshi and a Toa Nuva are much more similar in their overall size. Obviously, this is hunched down a little bit with those knees being bent, but you kind of get the idea there. So these are something that can absolutely play against each other, and it helps to give just a little bit more life back to the Toa Nuva sets. Because 2003 is a really interesting year in Bionicle's history too, in that we get no good guy canister sets. We get the little box sets with the Matoran, but there are no Toa Nuva in 2003, aside from Taka Nuva. That comes in a boxed set. And yes, of course, that box set also tells a little bit of story with the Usul Nui, the name alone telling us that it is a subsequent model to the Usul crab, and the importance, even hinting at us who Taka Nuva was if we didn't see the movies. We know that Takua came with the Usul crab, and now all of a sudden Taka Nuva's got the Usul Nui. Like, that's a good sort of little bit of play there. But also, that build has 6 silver Krata backs on it. There are 6 Rahkshi. This tells you, and it especially pairs alongside the silver Toa Nuva masks, which are powerless masks, remember, that the Rahkshi have been defeated by the time that that machine was made. So where 2003 doesn't succeed in the same way in the form of battle, it does succeed in collectability. There are far more Krata than there were Krana, than there were masks. In tradability, assuming that you want to trade, and those two things are inherently tied to each other, trading and collectability, because trading in essence, and I've always said this, is a form of advertisement for LEGO, so they do want to incentivize it whenever they can. And while battle definitely falters some, the story is greatly elevated, not just through the media, not just through the very first Bionicle movie and all of the subsequent books and comics that went along with it, and even games that went out there as well, but also with the models themselves. And that's important. That's something that we shouldn't overlook, because there's so much to appreciate about Bionicle in the little details. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to subscribe. It definitely helps out the channel tremendously. And I'm going to see y'all in the next one. Hopefully, maybe I should have saved the hidden feature for the next one. I'll probably include it in another video because I tend to do so. Anyway, take care.